These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised. The first winter I spent living alone was the quietest year of my life, and for a while, I felt that was exactly what I needed. I had moved out to a rural stretch of Montana a little over 5 years ago. After spending most of my 20s in my parents' house in Oregon, I finally decided it was time to figure out life on my own terms. My parents had been nudging me for years to get my own place, and eventually I stopped arguing with them and just did it. The house I found sat on a patch of land about 20 minutes outside a small town called Ashbrook. It wasn't much to look at, just a modest one-story house with a gravel driveway and a small detached shed. But the property stretched out for acres, and the nearest neighbor was far enough away that you couldn't see their house unless you walked down the road for several minutes. To most people, that kind of isolation would probably feel uncomfortable, but to me, it sounded perfect. I've never been the most social person. I don't hate people, I just don't go out of my way to meet them either. Living somewhere quiet where nobody expected conversation felt like the ideal setup. For the first couple of years, that's exactly what it was. My routine was simple. I worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant in town during the day, drove home in the evenings, made dinner, watched a little television, and went to bed. Weekends were usually spent fixing small things around the property or driving into town for groceries. I didn't really know the neighbors, and they didn't know me. In fact, weeks would sometimes pass where I didn't see another person outside of work. It was peaceful. The first sign that winter was going to be rough that year came in early February. The weather had been cold for weeks already, but that afternoon, the sky turned a dull gray color that made it feel like the entire world was dimming. Around 2 in the afternoon, snow started falling. At first, it was light, the kind of snowfall that barely sticks to the ground. No one at work paid much attention to it, but within an hour, the situation changed dramatically. The wind picked up, the flakes grew heavier, and the visibility outside the shop windows dropped until it looked like someone had draped a white curtain over the entire parking lot. My supervisor eventually walked out onto the floor and shouted over the machinery that everyone should start heading home before the roads became impassable. Normally, I drove a small sedan, but that winter I had bought an older, lifted pickup truck specifically because the rural roads near my house were notorious for getting buried in snow. When I climbed into the truck that afternoon, I wasn't especially worried about the drive. I had handled storms like this before. Still, about halfway through the trip home, I started to reconsider that confidence. The wind had grown violent, shoving the truck sideways whenever the road opened into flat farmland. Snow whipped across the windshield so thickly that the headlights reflected back at me like a wall of glittering dust. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and leaned forward in my seat, squinting through the storm. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to my property, I was more relieved than anything else. The truck crawled down the final stretch of driveway, tires crunching through several inches of fresh snow. When I finally parked near the front steps, I shut the engine off and sat there for a moment, listening to the wind rattle the side of the house. Home, I muttered to myself. I stepped out into the storm, hunched against the wind, and hurried toward the front door. Snow was already piling up against the steps. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I pulled the key from my pocket and slid it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. At first, I thought I just missed the slot, so I tried again. Still nothing. The lock refused to move. It took me a few seconds to realize what had happened. The lock had frozen solid. I leaned closer to the door and tried again, twisting harder this time. The metal groaned slightly, but didn't budge. I blew warm air onto the keyhole and cupped my hands around it, hoping the heat from my breath might loosen whatever ice had formed inside. Nothing worked. After a few minutes of trying everything I could think of, frustration began creeping in. I even knocked on the door a couple of times, as if the house itself might decide to let me in. Finally, I gave up and walked back to the truck. Inside, the heater blasted warm air across my face while the windshield slowly disappeared under a growing layer of snow. I stared through the glass at my dark house and tried to think of a solution. Maybe the storm would calm down in an hour or two. If that happened, I could drive into town and buy some de-icer or call a locksmith. But as the minutes passed, the storm only intensified. Snow piled up so quickly that the tires were beginning to sink into it. I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. If I waited too long, the truck might get stuck in the driveway completely. That thought pushed me into action. I started the engine again and tried to reverse out, hoping to make it back to the road before the snow became too deep. The truck lurched slightly, tires spinning against the gravel beneath the growing snowpack. Then it stopped moving entirely. I pressed the accelerator harder. The tires spun uselessly. The truck wasn't going anywhere. For the first time that evening, a real sense of unease settled over me. The storm was worsening by the minute. My house was locked behind a frozen door, and my vehicle was now stuck in the driveway. I leaned back in the seat and rubbed my forehead. There was one option left. Somewhere down the road were a few other houses. I had driven past them plenty of times, but never stopped. I didn't know the people who lived there, and they certainly didn't know me. But at that moment, pride didn't matter. Staying in the truck all night wasn't realistic. Eventually, the gas would run out, and then I'd be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. So I shut off the engine, zipped my coat all the way to my chin, and stepped back out into the storm. The closest house was roughly a quarter-mile down the road. Under normal conditions, it would have been an easy walk, but the blizzard turned every step into a struggle. Snow blasted against my face and gathered in the folds of my jacket. The wind howled so loudly it drowned out almost every other sound. By the time the outline of the small house finally appeared through the swirling white, my legs were trembling from the cold. It was a tiny single-story place with peeling paint and a sagging porch roof. A dim yellow light glowed through one of the windows. I climbed the steps and knocked as loudly as I could. For a full minute, nothing happened. I was just about to turn away and head for the next house down the road when the door suddenly flew open. The man standing there looked to be in his early 50s. His hair was thin and gray around the edges, and his expression was oddly blank, like he had been pulled out of a deep thought. He stared at me for several seconds before speaking. "Yeah?" he said. I quickly explained my situation, pointing back toward the direction of my house and mentioning the frozen lock and the stuck truck. The man listened quietly. Then he gave a slow nod. "Storm's getting worse," he said. After another moment, he stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. "My name's Calvin," he added. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. But the moment the door closed behind me, something about the place made the back of my neck tighten, and I couldn't explain why. The warmth inside the house should have been comforting, but the moment the door shut behind me, I felt an odd tension settle in my chest. It wasn't anything obvious. The place was just a small living room with faded carpet, an old couch, and a lamp casting a dull yellow glow across the walls. It looked like the kind of home someone had lived in for decades without bothering to change anything. Calvin motioned toward the couch. "You can sit," he said quietly. I thanked him and lowered myself onto the worn cushions, trying to steady my breathing after the walk through the blizzard. My fingers were still numb, and it took a moment before the warmth of the room started working its way back into them. Calvin took a seat across from me and a sagging armchair. For a few minutes, we exchanged the kind of basic conversations strangers usually have in situations like that. I told him my name was Ethan, that I lived down the road, and that the lock on my front door had frozen shut. He nodded while I spoke, but something about the way he listened unsettled me. His eyes didn't stay in one place. They flicked around the room constantly, from me to the ceiling to the wall behind me, then down to the floor. It wasn't subtle either. It looked almost involuntary, like he couldn't focus on a single point for more than a second or two. At first, I assumed he was nervous. After all, I had just shown up at his door unannounced during a storm. But the longer we sat there, the stranger it felt. I would ask him a question, and he'd begin answering it normally before suddenly trailing off halfway through the sentence. His gaze would drift to some random spot on the wall as if something there had stolen his attention. Then he'd blink and snap back to the conversation like nothing had happened. The whole interaction made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain. Eventually, I decided the best thing to do was keep things simple. "I'm pretty wiped out from that walk," I said, rubbing my hands together. "Would you mind if I just crashed here until the storm lets up?" For the first time since I had arrived, Calvin's expression actually softened. "Yeah, that's fine. You can sleep on the couch." I nodded gratefully. "Would you mind turning the light off?" Without saying another word, he reached over and clicked the lamp off. The room fell into darkness except for a faint blue glow coming through the snow-covered window. But Calvin didn't leave. He stood in the doorway between the living room and the hallway, completely still. At first, I thought he was about to say something, but several seconds passed, then nearly a full minute. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I kept my eyes half closed, pretending I was already drifting off to sleep. Eventually, he turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps disappearing into another room. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I really did try to sleep. The couch was surprisingly comfortable, and the exhaustion from the cold should have knocked me out quickly. But every time I started drifting off, something pulled me back awake. At first, it was just that strange feeling you get in unfamiliar places. Then the sound started. A dull thump. It came from somewhere above me. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. Another sound followed a few seconds later. A scraping noise. At first, I told myself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens during heavy storms sometimes. The weight builds up until part of it slides slightly. But after listening for a minute, something about the noise didn't feel right. It wasn't sliding. It sounded like movement. Slow, deliberate movement. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Then another loud thump echoed through the room. This one was so sudden that I sat straight up on the couch. And that's when I saw him. Calvin was standing in the doorway again. I had no idea how long he'd been there. My stomach dropped. Hey, I started to say. Before the words were even fully out of my mouth, he lunged. He didn't just walk toward me, he charged. 1 second he was in the doorway, the next he was flying over the back of the couch, slamming me with his full weight. We crashed to the floor. For a moment, everything was chaos. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, and before I could even react, his arm wrapped around my neck in a chokehold. Panic exploded through me. I grabbed at his arm, trying to pull it away, but he was stronger than he looked. His grip tightened, cutting off my air. "Stop fighting," he yelled. "Just stop." I struggled harder, kicking and twisting my body. He kept yelling, "You don't understand. She's lonely. She needs someone." The words barely registered through the adrenaline flooding my head. "She'll like you," he continued, his voice cracking. "You'll keep her company." I shoved my elbow backward as hard as I could and felt it connect with something solid. His grip loosened just enough for me to wrench myself free. I scrambled backward across the carpet, gasping for air. Calvin was still on the floor, staring at me with wide, frantic eyes. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I grabbed my coat off the couch and bolted for the door. Behind me, I heard him shouting something. "She won't be happy," he screamed. "You can't leave." But I was already outside. The storm hit me like a wall the moment I burst through the door. Snow whipped across my face, instantly freezing the sweat on my skin. I ran. I didn't stop to put on my coat, didn't look back. I just ran down the road towards the next house I could barely see through the blizzard. When I finally reached it, I pounded on the door so hard my hands started to hurt. A man and woman answered. They took one look at me, soaked with snow and breathing like I'd run a marathon, and pulled me inside without asking questions. That night, I slept on their couch. The next morning, after the storm had calmed down, we sat around their kitchen table drinking coffee while I explained everything that had happened. The man introduced himself as Daniel and his wife was Lena. As soon as I described the small house down the road, Daniel's expression changed. "Wait, was the guy's name Calvin?" I nodded. Daniel leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Yeah, figures." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Daniel and Lena exchanged a look before he answered. Calvin's been strange for years, he said carefully. Then he told me something that made the back of my neck itch again. About 10 years ago, Calvin's wife disappeared, just vanished. No police investigation ever proved anything. No body was ever found. But according to most people in the area, everyone believed Calvin had killed her. I sat there quietly, replaying everything he'd said the night before. She's lonely. She needs someone. A cold feeling crept down my spine. I did report the incident to the police later that week, but as far as I know, nothing ever came from it. Calvin still lives in that house, and I still live in mine. 3 years have passed since that night. Nothing else has happened, but every time I drive past his property, I catch myself looking towards the house, half expecting to see him standing in the window, watching the road, waiting for someone else to knock on his door during the next storm. Last winter was one of the harshest winters I can remember, and there was one night during that storm that I still think about more often than I'd like. Even now, whenever the wind picks up and the snow starts coming down hard, I find myself remembering every detail of that evening. At the time, I was 27 and living alone in a small rental house in a quiet rural area of upstate New York. I worked remotely in finance, which sounds impressive when people hear it, but the reality is much less exciting. Most days I sat at my desk for hours staring at spreadsheets, answering emails, and attending video calls that could have easily been emails instead. Working from home meant I rarely had a reason to leave the house during the week. Sometimes I realized on Friday that I hadn't stepped outside since Monday morning. The isolation didn't really bother me though. I'd grown used to the quiet. A few days before the storm, the local news had started warning people about a major blizzard heading our way. At first, it sounded like the usual exaggeration you hear every winter. Meteorologists love throwing around phrases like historic snowfall or dangerous conditions, and half the time it ends up being nothing more than a few inches of slush. But this time, they seemed serious. By the morning the storm was supposed to arrive, emergency alerts were being sent out advising people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. They recommended stocking up on food, keeping flashlights ready, and preparing for possible power outages. So that morning, I drove into town and bought groceries for the weekend. Nothing fancy, just enough food to get me through a few days if the roads became impossible to drive on. By early afternoon, I was back home, putting things away and settling in for what I assumed would be a quiet couple of days working remotely. The snow began falling sometime around mid-afternoon. At first, it was light, barely visible against the gray sky. I glanced out the window a few times while working, but didn't think much of it. By the time evening rolled around, though, the storm had intensified dramatically. By 8 o'clock that night, the world outside my windows had disappeared into a swirling wall of white. The wind howled constantly, rattling the siding of the house and making the branches of the nearby trees scrape against the roof. It was a strange sound, almost like the entire house was sitting inside a giant tunnel where the wind never stopped moving. I spent most of the evening on the couch with the television on in the background while I scrolled through my phone. The storm was strong enough that even the local news stations had stopped normal programming and were just showing weather updates. Around 10:30 that night, I heard a new sound. It was loud enough to cut through the wind. A dull thud. At first, I ignored it, assuming a tree branch had fallen somewhere nearby. There were several old oak trees near my driveway, and storms like this had knocked down branches before. But a few seconds later, I heard something else, a dragging noise. It sounded like something heavy being pulled slowly across wood or gravel. I muted the television and sat up, listening carefully. The sound stopped. For a moment, the only thing I could hear was the wind roaring outside again. I shrugged it off and leaned back against the couch, telling myself it was probably just debris shifting around in the storm. About 15 minutes passed before the next sound happened. This time, it was unmistakable. A car horn. It wasn't a normal honk either. It sounded weak and uneven, like someone had accidentally leaned against it. I stood up and walked over to the front window. Through the swirling snow, I could barely see the end of my driveway, but there were definitely headlights shining through the storm. A vehicle was stopped out near the road. I stood there watching for several minutes, waiting to see if someone would step out of the car. Nothing happened. The snow was falling so thickly that it was impossible to tell what kind of vehicle it was or how long it had been there. The headlights were the only clear thing visible through the storm. My first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It wouldn't have been surprising. The road outside my house curved slightly, and in weather like that, it wouldn't take much for a car to lose control. Still, I wasn't exactly eager to walk out into a blizzard just to check on a stranger. The wind was brutal and the visibility was almost non-existent. If the driver had a phone, they could easily call for help themselves. After another minute of staring out the window, I turned away and went back to the couch. But the situation didn't leave my mind. About 30 minutes later, just as I was considering heading to bed, someone knocked on my front door. The sound made me freeze. It was 3 quick knocks, not loud, but very deliberate. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, my heart beating a little faster now. Instead of opening it right away, I called out through the wood. "Hello?" A man's voice answered from the other side. "Hey, my car's stuck. I've been walking for a while. Could I come inside for a minute to warm up and use a phone?" His voice sounded strained, like he was out of breath. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me felt bad for him. If he really had been walking through that storm, he was probably freezing. But something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I slowly unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches, keeping the security chain locked in place. The man standing on my porch was covered in snow. His jacket, his shoulders, even his hair were dusted with it, like he'd been standing in the storm for a long time. He was shorter than me, maybe in his mid-30s, and he was visibly shivering. "My car died. I've been trying to find a house with lights on," he said quickly. "I could call someone for you," I said slowly. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he stepped a little closer to the door. "That'd be great, but could I come inside while you do it? I'm freezing out here." I was about to agree, but then something caught my attention. I looked down at his boots and immediately felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Because despite everything else about him being covered in snow, his boots were perfectly clean. The moment I noticed his boots, something deep in my gut told me to be careful. They were completely clean. Not just a little cleaner than expected, completely clean and dry. No packed snow around the soles, no wet streaks running down the sides, nothing. If someone had really walked through a blizzard for any real distance, their boots would have been covered in slush and ice. Mine looked like that after walking 10 steps to the mailbox. For a few seconds, I just stared at them. Then I slowly lifted my eyes back up to his face. He was still standing there, shivering on the porch, snow clinging to his shoulders and hair. If I hadn't noticed his boots, I probably would have opened the door all the way without thinking. But now the whole scene felt wrong. "I'll call someone for you," I repeated, keeping my voice as calm as possible. His expression tightened slightly. "It would just be easier if I came inside," he said. "I'm really cold." The tone of his voice had changed just a little. It wasn't pleading anymore. It sounded more impatient. I shook my head. "I'm going to call for help right now." Without waiting for another response, I closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. For a moment, I stood there listening. At first, there was silence. Then I heard him say something quietly on the other side of the door, but the wind carried most of the words away. Whatever he said, it didn't sound friendly. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her about the car near the end of my driveway, the man at the door asking to come inside, and the strange detail about his boots. While I was still talking to her, I heard footsteps moving across the wooden boards of the porch. But instead of walking away toward the road, the footsteps moved along the side of the house. My stomach tightened. "He's walking around the house," I told the operator quietly. She immediately told me to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. Police were being dispatched, but because of the storm, it might take them some time to reach my area. I turned off the lights in the living room and carefully moved toward the side window. I kept myself low so I wouldn't be visible from outside. Through the glass, I could see him. He was standing near the corner of the house, maybe 15 feet away, staring up toward the windows. Not moving, just standing there. The snow blew around him violently, but he didn't react to it at all. He just kept looking at the house. I backed away from the windows slowly. A few seconds later, a loud crash shook the back of the house. I nearly dropped my phone. Someone was slamming against the back door. The banging was violent, each hit rattling the entire frame like it might splinter open. I heard the operator saying something through the phone, but my focus had shifted entirely to the sound. Bang, bang, bang. It sounded like someone was trying to break their way inside. I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I owned and backed toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. "The police are on the way," the operator said. "Stay somewhere secure." I hurried into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. For the next several minutes, I stood there holding the knife, staring at the door while my heart pounded against my ribs. The banging stopped suddenly. The silence afterward was somehow worse. I had no idea if he was still outside or if he had already broken into another part of the house. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Time felt strange in that moment. It could have been 10 minutes or 30. Eventually, my arms started to ache from gripping the knife so tightly. Then I heard something outside again. The car horn, the same one from earlier, but this time it wasn't a short accidental honk. It was one long, continuous blast. It went on for several seconds before stopping. About 5 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed through my bedroom window. The police had arrived. I slowly unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway just as one of the officers knocked loudly on the front door. When I opened it, 2 officers stood on the porch, snow swirling around their uniforms. They stepped inside and immediately began asking questions. I told them everything about the car, the man at the door, the clean boots, the banging on the back door. One of the officers walked around the house while the other stayed inside with me. After a few minutes, the first officer returned. "We found a car down the road," he said, "half buried in a snowbank." My stomach tightened. That must be it. But the officer shook his head slightly. The strange thing is, the engine was cold. Cold, meaning it hadn't been driven recently. They told me something else that made the situation even stranger. There were no footprints in the snow between the car and my house. The snowfall was heavy enough that tracks could disappear quickly, but according to them, the area between the road and my driveway looked completely undisturbed. The only tracks they found were around my house, footprints leading up my driveway, footprints circling the property, but none leading from the car. The officers searched the surrounding area for nearly an hour but didn't find anyone. Eventually, they left, telling me to call again immediately if anything else happened. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight reflected off the fresh snow, making everything look strangely peaceful compared to the chaos of the night before. I stepped outside to look around the property. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop again. There were muddy handprints on the outside of my bedroom window. They were smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed both hands against it, trying to look inside. The police hadn't mentioned anything about those the night before, which meant one of two things. Either the person had come back after the officers left, or they had never left at all. A few days later, I learned that a house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The owner hadn't been home at the time, so no one was hurt, but there was something strange about the break-in. Nothing had been stolen. Whoever entered the house hadn't taken any electronics, money, or valuables. They hadn't taken anything. They just went inside and left. I still think about that night sometimes. About the man standing on my porch asking to come inside, about the clean boots, about the handprints on my window, and about how easily things could have gone differently if I had opened the door just a little wider. The call came at 2:13 a.m. At first, Rahat thought it was just another spam call. His phone vibrated across the wooden table beside his bed, the screen glowing in the dark room. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but the vibration kept going, longer than normal, as if whoever was calling had no intention of hanging up. Half asleep, Rahat grabbed the phone and answered. "Hello?" For a few seconds, there was only static. Then someone whispered, "You shouldn't be there." Rahat frowned. "Who is this?" Silence. Then the same voice, softer this time. "You shouldn't be in that house." The call ended. Rahat sat up in bed, suddenly awake. He stared at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. No name, no location. He checked the time again. 2:14 a.m. "Probably a prank," he muttered. Still, something about the voice felt wrong. Not threatening, not angry, just worried, like someone trying to warn him. He placed the phone back on the table and lay down again. The old house creaked softly around him as the night wind pushed against the wooden walls. It was his third night here, and honestly, he still wasn't used to the silence. The house stood at the edge of a quiet village road, surrounded by tall trees and abandoned land. Rahat had rented it cheaply while working on a photography project about rural life. The landlord had barely asked questions. "You can stay as long as you want," the old man had said. Now Rahat wondered if there was a reason the place was so cheap. The first night had been normal. The second night, less so. He'd heard footsteps upstairs. The problem was, the house didn't have an upstairs, at least one he could access. The staircase at the end of the hallway led up to a locked wooden door. The landlord told me it had been sealed for years. "Storage," the man said quickly. Rahat hadn't pushed further, but around midnight when the house became quiet enough, the sounds would start. Slow steps. Creak, creak, creak. Like someone walking carefully across old floorboards. He'd convinced himself it was animals or the wood expanding in the cold. Until tonight. Until the phone call. Rahat turned to his side and tried to sleep again, but his mind refused to relax. "You shouldn't be there." The voice replayed in his head. Who would even know he was here? Only two people, his landlord and his friend Arif, who helped him move his camera gear yesterday. That was it. So who called, and how did they know about the house? Rahat exhaled slowly. "Enough," he whispered. He closed his eyes. Minutes passed. The wind outside grew stronger, rustling the tall trees around the property. Then, creak. Rahat's eyes opened. The sound came from the hallway, not upstairs, not outside, inside the house. He listened carefully. Silence returned. Then it came again. Creak. A floorboard. Someone was walking, very slowly. Rahat sat up. His bedroom door was slightly open, letting a thin line of darkness stretch across the floor. The hallway light was off, but something moved out there, a shadow shifting across the wall. Rahat grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. "Hello?" he called. No answer. The hallway looked empty. The old wooden floor, the closed staircase door, the dusty table against the wall. Nothing else. Rahat stepped out of his room. The house felt colder than before. He walked slowly down the hallway, each step making the floor complain. "Is someone here?" he asked. Still nothing. He reached the staircase. The locked door stood exactly where it always had. Old wood, rusty metal lock. But now something was different tonight. The door was slightly open, just a few centimeters. Rahat stared at it. He was sure it had been fully closed before. The landlord even showed him the lock. "This door stays shut," the man said. Yet now there was a narrow gap, darkness beyond it. Rahat felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Hello?" he said again, quieter. No reply. He pushed the door gently. It opened with a long, painful creak. Behind it was the staircase, old wooden steps leading upward into complete darkness. Dust floated in the beam of Rahat's flashlight. It looked like nobody had used the stairs in years, but Rahat could clearly see something disturbing. Fresh footprints, bare feet, leading up. His heart started beating faster. Someone had walked up there recently, and the prints looked wet, as if the person had stepped in water before climbing. Rahat swallowed. The phone call echoed in his mind again. "You shouldn't be there." He looked up the staircase. The darkness above seemed too deep, too thick, like the light didn't want to enter it. Then he heard it. From the floor above, a slow dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. Scrape. Rahat froze. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. Another sound followed, a soft whisper, not from the phone, from upstairs. "Hello?" Rahat's chest tightened. The voice sounded weak, almost desperate. "Please help me." Rahat stared into the darkness. Every instinct told him to close the door and go to bed, pretend none of this existed. But the voice came again, closer this time. "Is someone there?" Rahat took a slow step onto the first stair. The wood creaked loudly under his weight. The whisper stopped. The house became completely silent. Too silent. Rahat held his breath. Then something moved at the top of the stairs. Just for a moment. A shadow, tall, standing at the edge of the darkness, watching him. Rahat lifted the flashlight higher. The beam reached the top step, but the figure was gone. Only an empty hallway remained, and one door, at the very end, slowly swinging open by itself. Creak. Rahat felt a cold wave sweep through his body, because from inside that room, he could hear breathing. Not one person, more than one, and one of them whispered again. "He came up." Another voice answered, "Good." Then the door at the end of the hall slammed shut, violently. The entire house shook, and Rahat realized something terrifying. The wet footprints on the stairs were no longer only going up. New ones had appeared behind him, coming down. Rahat didn't move. His flashlight beam shook slightly in his hand as he stared at the wet footprints behind him. They were fresh, shiny in the light, and they hadn't been there a second ago. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. The staircase below him was empty. No one, no sound, just the narrow hallway at the bottom and the front door beyond it. But the footprints were real, bare feet, stepping down the stairs, step by step, stopping just 2 steps below where Rahat stood. Like whoever made them was now standing right behind him, breathing, watching. Rahat felt his throat tighten. He didn't dare turn around fully. Instead, he whispered, "Who's there?" No response. Only the faint sound of breathing. Not loud, not aggressive, just close. Too close. Rahat forced himself to look over his shoulder. The stairs were empty. Nothing stood behind him, but the breathing continued, right next to his ear. He spun around quickly. "Stop!" The flashlight beam jumped wildly across the staircase walls. Still nothing. The air felt colder. He could see his breath now, and the footprints behind him slowly began to fade, like water drying on wood. Within seconds, they disappeared completely. Rahat's chest rose and fell rapidly. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself, but deep down he knew that wasn't true, because the sounds upstairs had started again. Scrape. Something heavy dragging across the floor, then a dull thud, followed by quiet whispering. Rahat looked up the stairs again. The door at the end of the hallway upstairs remained closed, but light was leaking out from underneath it now. A pale yellow glow. It hadn't been there before. Someone was inside that room. He thought about running, leaving the house immediately, getting in his car and driving until sunrise, but something held him in place. Curiosity, or maybe fear of what might follow him if he ran. Slowly, Rahat climbed the rest of the stairs. Each step groaned loudly beneath him. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched ahead like a narrow tunnel. Old pictures hung crooked on the walls, their glass frames dusty. Faces inside them faded with age. Family portraits, people who once lived here. But something about the photos felt wrong. As Rahat walked past them, he noticed something strange. Every face had been scratched out, deep claw marks across eyes and mouths, as if someone had tried to erase them. The whispering behind the door grew clearer, multiple voices murmuring over each other. Rahat stopped in front of the door. The yellow light underneath flickered slightly. He pressed his ear against the wood. The whispers instantly stopped. Total silence. Then a single voice spoke, right on the other side. "You heard us." Rahat stepped back. "Yes," he said quietly. A pause. Then the voice asked something strange. "Did he call you too?" Rahat felt a chill. The phone call? Silence again. Then another voice joined, lower. "Then it's too late." The door handle slowly turned. Click. The door opened by itself. The room inside was empty and small. No furniture, no people, just a single hanging light bulb swinging from the ceiling. And the floor. The floor was covered in footprints, hundreds of them, bare feet, stepping down in circles across the wooden boards. Rahat stepped inside slowly. "Hello?" The door slammed shut behind him. The light bulb stopped swinging. The room became completely still. Then Rahat noticed the walls. They were covered in writing, names, dozens of them, scratched into the wood with something sharp, some fresh, some old. Every name had a date beside it, and every date ended the same way, with the word "stayed." Rahat moved closer to the wall. His heart started pounding. At the very bottom of the list was a fresh scratch mark, a name being carved slowly into the wood, but no one was holding the knife. The letters appeared on their own. R-A-H-A-T. He stumbled backward. "No, no!" The whispering returned, but this time it filled the entire room, coming from everywhere. The floor, the ceiling, inside the walls. "We stayed. You came upstairs. Now you stay too." Rahat rushed to the door and tried the handle. It wouldn't move. Locked. "Let me out!" The light bulb flickered violently. For a brief second, shadows filled the room, dozens of them, standing around him, barefoot figures, tall, thin, watching silently. Then the light returned, and the shadows were gone, but the last word carved in the wall finished itself. "Stayed." Rahat pounded on the door. "Help! Someone help!" But no sound escaped the room. The house outside remained silent. Minutes later, Rahat's phone vibrated in his pocket. He slowly pulled it out. Unknown number. The same one. His hands shook as he answered. Hello? The same whisper came through the speaker. You shouldn't have gone upstairs. The call ended. The light bulb went out, and the house became quiet again. 2 weeks later, the landlord unlocked the front door for a new renter. The young man stepped inside with a suitcase. Nice place, he said. Quiet. The landlord nodded. Yes. As the man walked down the hallway, he noticed the old staircase door slightly open. What's upstairs? The landlord quickly closed it. Just storage. But that night, at 2:13 a.m., the new renter's phone rang. Unknown number. And when he answered, a tired voice whispered from the other side, Please don't go upstairs.